They still don't know how you did it. That's the part eating at them the most. No scene, no meltdown, no dramatic announcement that could be pointed at and dissected. Just a quiet internal shift that cracked the entire structure they had built around you. One day, everything worked the way it always had. The next, it didn't, and there was no obvious reason why. For a long time, they thought they had you figured out. You were predictable in a way that made them comfortable. You reacted when pushed, you explained when questioned. You adjusted when the pressure rose. That version of you fit neatly into their expectations, their narratives, their sense of control. They could label you, reference you, anticipate you, and because they thought they understood you, they assumed you would always remain accessible. What they never noticed was where the real change was happening. Not on the surface, not in anything loud or visible. The shift happened internally, in places they never had access to. You stopped feeding the systems that relied on your emotional participation. You stopped correcting false assumptions. You stopped rushing to clarify your intentions. You didn't fight back. You didn't rebel. You simply reclaimed your energy without explanation. That single decision changed everything. The moment you withdrew your reactions, the machinery around you started failing. Conversations stalled where they used to flow. Old triggers stopped producing results. The familiar buttons they pressed out of habit suddenly did nothing. And that silence, your silence, made them deeply uncomfortable. Because reaction gave them leverage. Explanation gave them entry points. Engagement gave them relevance. When you removed all three, they were left standing in front of a closed system. You didn't vanish. You were still present, still moving through the same spaces, still showing up. But you were no longer available in the way they were used to. No longer open to projection. No longer responsive to manipulation. You became calm without being passive, distant without being cold, grounded without being defensive. And that combination broke their logic. They tried to make sense of it, replayed old interactions in their heads, looked for the exact moment they missed, tried to decode your silence into something familiar: anger, bitterness, insecurity. But none of those explanations fit. What they were facing wasn't emotional withdrawal. It was clarity. And clarity is threatening to people who depend on confusion to maintain influence. You stopped participating in dynamics that required you to abandon yourself. You stopped shrinking to keep others comfortable. You stopped doing emotional labor just to be seen as agreeable or safe. Quietly, without ceremony, you realized that not everything deserves your response, and not everyone deserves access to your inner world. That realization changed how you moved. Where you once explained, you now observed. Where you once engaged, you now paused. Where you once reacted, you chose stillness. And stillness, when it comes from self-trust, carries a kind of authority that can't be challenged directly. At first, they mistook it for weakness, thought you were tired, burned out, slowly unraveling. That illusion held until they realized none of their usual tactics worked anymore. Guilt didn't pull you back in, concern didn't hook you, gossip didn't provoke you. Even false narratives failed to bait you into defending yourself. That's when confusion turned into panic. Because when control stops working, the people who relied on it start to feel exposed. They needed you to stay readable, to remain emotionally available for their interpretations. Your growth wasn't supposed to happen without their approval, or at least their involvement. And yet there you were, evolving quietly, building something solid away from their gaze, becoming someone they could no longer categorize. You weren't louder. You weren't proving anything. You were simply aligned. And alignment doesn't announce itself. It changes outcomes. They noticed rooms felt different when you were around. Conversations shifted. People chose words more carefully, or stopped speaking altogether. Your absence began to carry more weight than your presence ever had before. You didn't chase relevance. You became undeniable by not trying. That's when they felt it. Not anger, not hatred. Something worse. Irrelevance. They started reaching for ways back in. Casual check-ins, sudden concern, questions framed as care, anything to confirm that you were still affected, still reachable, still orbiting the old dynamics. But you weren't. Somewhere in the quiet, away from the noise, the opinions, the constant pressure to explain, you chose yourself. And that choice had consequences they weren't ready to face. Once you chose yourself, everything else began to rearrange without asking permission. You didn't announce boundaries. You didn't deliver speeches. You didn't demand respect. You simply stopped overextending, And that quiet withdrawal exposed how much of the connection had depended on your effort alone. When you stopped supplying energy, attention, and emotional access, the imbalance became obvious. They didn't know what to do with that. At first, they tried to reinsert themselves gently, testing the edges. Casual messages, light questions, concern dressed up as curiosity. They weren't really checking on you. They were checking whether the old doors were still unlocked, whether they could still step into your inner world the way they used to. But you had changed the locks without making a sound. You weren't withholding out of spite. You were complete, and that difference mattered more than they understood. Withholding still carries tension. Completion doesn't. Completion closes loops without confrontation. It doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It just moves forward. And that forward motion made their efforts feel increasingly desperate. They told themselves your calm was temporary, a phase, a coping strategy, something that would crack under enough pressure. That belief helped them avoid a harder truth. You weren't detaching to punish anyone. You detached because staying connected required you to abandon yourself. And once you cross that line consciously, there's no nostalgia powerful enough to pull you back. You noticed the quiet first. Not an empty quiet, a clean one. The kind that finally lets you hear your own thoughts without interruption, without commentary, without the low-grade tension of being constantly interpreted. That silence wasn't loneliness. It was relief. It was the sound of your energy consolidating instead of leaking outward. You became selective, not closed. Selective. You recognized that proximity isn't the same as connection, and familiarity isn't the same as respect. You saw how often your openness had been mistaken for availability, your patience for permission, your kindness for access. When you withdrew all three at once, the illusion collapsed. They started asking questions they couldn't answer without looking at themselves. Why does your absence feel heavier than your presence ever did? Why does your silence feel final instead of avoidant? Why does it feel like a verdict even though you never said a word? They wanted clarity from you. But what they really wanted was relief. Relief from the discomfort of knowing they lost access not through conflict, but through choice. Your choice. And choice is harder to argue with than anger. Anger can be debated. Distance can be negotiated. Alignment cannot. You didn't remove yourself loudly. You removed yourself cleanly. No emotional debris. No unfinished conversations. No mess left behind for them to analyze. That's what unsettled them the most. There was nothing to grab onto. No narrative to twist. No reaction to provoke. Just reality continuing without their influence. You kept moving while they stayed behind, trying to decode a version of you that no longer existed. And somewhere along the way you understood something most people never do. Not everyone loses you because they're malicious. Some lose you because they're misaligned, because the version of you that tolerated confusion, over-explaining, and emotional self-erasure had already done its work and stepped aside. This version doesn't argue. It doesn't chase understanding. It doesn't demand to be seen clearly. It simply exists with internal consistency. And that consistency changed how people felt around you. Your presence became heavier, not louder. More grounded, less negotiable. People sensed that you didn't need anything from them, not approval, not reassurance, not recognition. You stopped editing yourself for palatability. You stopped adjusting your truth to be easier to digest. And that shift altered every power dynamic you were part of. Because real power doesn't need to announce itself. It settles. It stabilizes. It becomes immovable. They still talk about you, but not the way they used to. Their certainty is gone. Their stories have gaps now. Sentences trail off. They're unsure where they stand with you. Unsure how you see them. Unsure whether they matter. That uncertainty is the echo of never truly seeing you when they had the chance. You aren't withholding closure. You're living past it. You've learned that closure isn't a conversation. It's a decision. A decision to stop revisiting rooms you've already outgrown. To stop explaining yourself to people invested in misunderstanding you. To let silence finish the work words never could. And silence did its job perfectly. By now they've realized something they can't undo. You're not coming back to who you were. Not emotionally. Not energetically. Not psychologically. The version of you they understood. The one they could predict, influence, lean on, or quietly benefit from. That version is gone. And no amount of reframing, reminiscing, or reaching out is going to resurrect it. What unsettles them most isn't that you changed. People change all the time. What unsettles them is that you changed without permission, without explanation, and without asking anyone to come with you. You didn't seek agreement. You didn't gather votes. You didn't wait until the environment felt safe. You moved when the internal signal was clear. And that kind of decisiveness exposes how much of their own lives are built on delay and negotiation with fear. They keep replaying interactions, trying to locate the moment things slipped, the sentence they should have said differently, the opportunity they missed, the point where they lost influence. But there was no single moment. That's the truth they can't accept. You didn't leave suddenly. You detached gradually, quietly. The moment you realized your presence required you to be smaller than your potential. And now the distance feels permanent because it is. You're no longer reacting to how you're perceived. That alone rewires everything. When someone stops calibrating themselves based on external response, they become unpredictable in a way that can't be managed. Not chaotic sovereign. You're not motivated by praise or provocation anymore. You're not pulled into defending your character or correcting assumptions. You let people think what they think because it no longer reaches you where you live. That's why their ego can't handle it. Ego needs engagement. It needs resistance or admiration to stay relevant. Your neutrality starves it. Your calm deprives it of fuel. You're not impressed. You're not threatened. You're not competing. You're simply unavailable to the dynamics that once defined the relationship. And without those dynamics, there's nothing for ego to stand on. They tell themselves stories to cope. That you're distant. That you've changed too much. That you're cold now. Labels are how people protect themselves from truth. Because the truth is harder to sit with. You didn't harden. You clarified. You didn't close your heart. You stopped wasting it. You didn't become less human. You became less accessible to what drained you. And here's the part that matters most. You didn't do this to make a point. You did it to survive intact. Somewhere along the way, you understood that constant explaining was costing you your center. That staying connected to certain people required ongoing self-abandonment. That peace wasn't going to come from being understood, but from being aligned. Once you made that shift, your behavior stopped needing justification. Your decisions stopped requiring witnesses. That's why your silence feels so loud to them now. You've reached a stage where your energy speaks before you do. Where people feel your boundaries without you stating them. Where your absence communicates more clearly than arguments ever could. You don't chase relevance, because relevance comes to those who are rooted. You don't demand respect because respect follows those who respect themselves consistently. They feel the loss now, not because you were loud or dominant, but because you were stabilizing. You were the one absorbing tension, smoothing edges, translating emotions, holding space. When you stepped back, the imbalance surfaced. The system didn't collapse because you attacked it. It collapsed because you stopped holding it together. And the final realization, the one they're only beginning to touch, is this. You didn't break anything that was healthy. You only revealed what depended on your self-sacrifice to function. You're not unreachable. You're just no longer available for dynamics that require confusion, overexertion, or emotional labor without reciprocity. You still connect deeply, but selectively. You still care, but intentionally. You still show up, but only where presence doesn't cost you yourself. That's not ego. That's maturity. So let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them wonder how they lost access without a fight. You're not responsible for helping them understand a version of you that no longer exists. You're busy living as the one you became when you finally stopped explaining and started choosing. You didn't hit their ego by trying. You hit it by leaving alignment intact and taking your energy with you.